Good morning, comrades. Right. What kind of hijinks are we going to get up to today that's going to get me in trouble? Let's find out, shall we? We got G Wolf in chat today. Take away what is dividing the left paywalls. You know what? Yeah, so like Bree and Greenwald, that conversation that they're like pumping like crazy that Nathan Robinson was a part of. You watched the free part? You're not sure what Greenwald thinks his end goal is? I haven't seen it yet. But yeah, the fact that like they're hyping it up like crazy and they're talking about like this is the most important thing that we can be talking about. And then they put it behind a paywall. It's just like, I don't know. I don't want to be like shit on somebody else's game or whatever, or shit on their product. And like again, like I have a lot of like critiques of what Bree's been up to lately, especially considering that she's not talking about the Virgil situation, which I don't really want to get into, but like it's not really come up. Yeah, 40 minutes of it for free, but like I don't know. I'm kind of like in a general sense against paywalls for that kind of stuff, just because like it restricts access to information, and if your information is important, then you're necessarily privileging it to people who have money, and I mean, obviously, yes, of course, people can like steal it or whatever, and you can just decide not to enforce that. That's true. However, like some people are just not gonna go out of their way to look for it or find it or anything else. So like you're necessarily restricting who gets to see it. And I don't know. I guess considering that, we have, this is a small platform. I'm very against that specifically because we're trying to get exposure. They're in a different perspective because they're trying to get like monetization, but still, I don't like it. I don't like it. Anyway, good morning. How's everybody doing today? Got up a little bit late today. Just rolled out of bed, so prep is not best. I was up late editing because I got to fill Robert's inbox now because he was cursing on the radio for the radio show that went out today. So sometimes I have to be the pay-per-view politics. That's a good way of putting it. I understand like having some paywalled content as well. Like if like we might start doing some stuff like movie reviews or like fun stuff for specifically just for Patreon people. But like I don't know if that's something that I would be like talking about. Like this is the same thing as the sort of debate over like free speech that Nathan Robinson and Glenn are doing right now. But I mean, like, so I'm not like entirely against it. But I mean, like, what that content is pretty like you want to be careful about that. Oh wow, Clarence Thomas. Yeah, I saw this. Clarence Thomas has decided that federal laws against marijuana may no longer be necessary. So like Democrats, hello, you better wake the fuck up because you're gonna get like outflanked on the left by the right wing.
Hey, Pete, real quick, there was another news-making moment today, if you will. The Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas stating that federal laws against marijuana may no longer be necessary. What prompted these remarks? What might their significance be?
Well, he chimed in, and the court declined to take up an appeal from a Colorado marijuana dispensary that said, look, we can't deduct normal business expenses like any other business does because the IRS won't let us do that because we're a marijuana business. And what Thomas said here is that the federal law is all over the map on this, that the Justice Department isn't enforcing the law. Congress won't give it the money to, but here's the IRS enforcing it. He called this a hodgepodge. And he said maybe the Supreme Court's ruling of 16 years ago, upholding federal marijuana laws, was time to take another look at
it. Yeah. I will say though, Boehner bought a lot of weed stock. That's true. Yeah, maybe that's as simple as that. Maybe he's just doing like good capitalism, from the perspective of he just wants to make money. So like that's the only thing that matters. That's a good point. That might be what's going on there. But I mean, again, the Dems are like programmed to lose like everything like all the time because the way that they like fit into the capital structure, they're going to get outflanked by the right because the right dictates policy in the United States, no matter if they have a majority or not. So like the fact that this is something that they're going after is, I guess, a good thing, or they at least feel like they have to pander towards is, I guess, a good thing. But I don't know. Got my coffee. Yeah, I got up a little bit late today, so I'm checking out. Maybe, I mean, the one thing about the Bree bad faith thing, a 2.5 hour conversation is a lot. So maybe like, yeah, I don't know. 40 minutes sounds short. 2.5 hours sounds a lot. Like, sounds heavy. I don't know. We talked a little bit yesterday about no, geez, the Onion. This is like me, by the way, because I'll get into these moods. Not lately, probably like not for the past week or so, but every now and then, like once a month, I get that unexpected urge to clean everything to a crazy extent. Man knows he must ride unexpected urge to clean as far as it'll take him. And like whenever I do that, like I end up like wiping myself out entirely. It's very like a little bit too real. What was I saying? I hate when I do that. Anyway, you clean up the house every 45 years. You just kind of get in that mood. Oh yeah. We talked a little bit about Mike Gravel yesterday, and yeah, one of the things that he did was read 4,000 pages of the Pentagon Papers, which was essentially like the secret internal documents of the U.S. military. Into like these were like secret papers that were talking about how like the Vietnam War was going horribly and the atrocities that the U.S. was committing and all these horrible things. And he, Mike Gravel, read 4,000 pages of these documents into the congressional record, effectively making them public, which is wild. It just became a part of the congressional record, which you can do as a congressperson. You can get away with it. And the person that leaked the documents, the Pentagon Papers, was Daniel Ellsberg. And Katie Halper had him on her show to talk a little bit about it. So let's find Ellsberg here. She can set it up
with an appearance in November, which was really great. And so I'm really happy to be bringing onto the show to talk about his life and his memory and his legacy, Mike Gravel's daughter, Lynn Mosier, as well as Dan Ellsberg, who you may recognize from the Pentagon.
Dan Ellsberg is the guy that leaked that essentially, leaked the Pentagon Papers. He was a staffer.
So Lynn and Dan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and so sorry for your loss, Lynn.
Like one of the like great like leakers in United States history. He was I believe he was a Marine. Yeah, he was a military analyst employed by the Rand Corporation. He released the Pentagon Papers, the Pentagon study of the U.S. government decision-making, the Vietnam War. And the U.S. like went after this dude too. Like they tried to bring him up on the Espionage Act, all these other things. And he's been very vocal in support of people like Chelsea Manning and even Julian Assange, Edward Snowden. Probably less so Assange. But he's definitely been someone that supports whistleblower laws.
Honestly, for the loss of Mike Gravel.
Thank you.
Don't fuck with the analysts, bro. Don't fuck with the analysts.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm grateful for you reaching out to me, and it's so wonderful to see Dan. I mean, my God, my dad loved you, and he loved what you stood for, which was courage. in the face of seeing such egregious wrongs that were being hidden. And I think the way you worked together, I mean, you were out on the lam, as I remember, recall from history that you were running on the run, and tried to get higher profile senators to read the Pentagon Papers or to get it out there. The newspapers were being harassed and shut down on their printing of any excerpts, and you somehow got in touch with my dad, and he jumped at the opportunity to get the Pentagon Papers out, because he knew how significant that was, and the electorate needs to be informed in order to make any proper decisions. So I'm blessed to be involved in my dad's life, and the important thing is that he wants not just the what he's done to be recognized, but to be taken forward. Because Dan, I'm sure you know this, which is the Supreme Court case where it's legal precedent now that any member of Congress, senator or otherwise, is protected, and they can release state secrets that are really important and necessary information for the public. So I want to turn the time over to you, Dan, because you were there doing it. But Mike's legacy and what he wanted to put forward is that there is legal precedent for doing the right thing that you both so courageously did. So yeah, I turn things over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Lynn. The problem with that is that Mike Gravel, my friend Mike Gravel, set a precedent that I can't think anyone else has taken advantage of in 50 years since then, because he pointed to the speech and debate clause, which enabled him to read on the floor of the Senate and not be questioned as to who had given it to him or what the circumstances. He could not be questioned, meaning he couldn't be forced to reveal the source, and he couldn't be prosecuted for doing that. But actually, there's a price for saying something that the president doesn't like or the head of your party doesn't like. And I don't think, no doubt, there have been some risks of that sort taken over the years. But in terms of actually reading out classified material that should be known and taking the risk of the reproval that will come from that, only Mike, before him and after us, showed that courage.
Yeah, it takes a lot of guts to do that, because it's basically like the entire U.S. government, every elected official, the president of the United States, both parties are against you when you do that. When you essentially like decide to talk about like the secret decision making that the U.S. empire, the architects of the U.S. empire at the Pentagon have been talking to one another, basically, like in a very real sense. And this is why there's always going to be some legitimacy to the both parties are bad line. There's always going to be something to that, because they cooperate specifically on the subject of U.S. imperialism. Joe Biden, we talked about this a lot, and Jeremy Scahill has done great reporting on this, but Joe Biden has essentially been one of the people at the forefront, senator for 40 or something years, 30 or 40 years. I can't remember the exact number, but most of the moves that he made with respect to foreign policy were extremely like right wing and in the interest of expanding the U.S. empire. So that's worth remembering. That's worth sort of like highlighting and putting forward. There is obviously differences beyond that. However, like when you go against this sort of bipartisan Democrat-Republican consensus, it was called at the time the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, which is the agreement between the Democrats and Republicans that we're just gonna, expand this empire, into, we're gonna, pro Vietnam War, for example, the Korean War still technically is happening, etc. Even going into Iraq, Afghanistan, in the 90s and 2000s, those are not positions. Those are not like wars that are just like, oh, the Republicans have gone crazy. The Democrats have also decided that we want to pursue this, and Joe Biden was all about it. So when you go against it, everybody looks at you. Barbara Lee took so much shit for being the sole vote against the war in Iraq. And it's just worth always remember that.
And I realized it was just 50 years ago, exactly this month, that I called him and asked him if it was true that he was going to that he was doing a filibuster against the draft, against the renewal of the draft. And he said, yes. I said, if he were really serious about that, I could give him enough material that would keep him busy speaking till Christmas, I said.
Till Christmas.
Said, yes, he'd be very anxious to do that. Well, there's been various accounts of how that got to him. I got Ben Bagdikian from the Post, who was taking back a series, to take back another box to give to Mike Gravel. And as a journalist, he was quite reluctant to do that just on a professional basis. He didn't think he should be an intermediary in this process. And I said, well, the Post doesn't get them unless Gravel gets them. So reluctantly, he did take them back and transferred them to Mike. A little known story, I think, is how Mike told me he addressed these 7,000 pages. I think it was somewhat less than that I had to give him at that point of the whole study. How could he deal with all this? And he called his staff together and he said, here's material I've gotten that should be out. The public should know it's been wrongfully withheld. I'm going to put it out one way or another. He had to make copies, many copies of it. And he said, so I need help on this, but it may be illegal. You may be subjecting yourself to prosecution if you do this. So I can't ask any one of you to do it. It has to be on a volunteer basis. And he added something then, actually, every one of them, I think no one did back out. But he said something that when I heard it, I was very moved by. He said, when I was in the Army, becoming a lieutenant, as a platoon leader, preparing to be a platoon leader, I think he went into counterintelligence of all things later. So he knew the abuses of the secrecy system at that point. But he said, we wore a patch on our arm in the Army, now not in the Marines, which I was in, which said, follow me. He said, Dan Ellsberg is out there all alone, and I want to join him. And that was, as I say, when I heard that, I was very impressed by that as a former platoon leader myself. And his people all did join him. His intent actually was to do an extremely long filibuster for which he prepared himself with a bag in which to urinate in down his pants so he couldn't be forced off the floor.
He brought a piss bag. He got a Whizzinator. Hell yeah. It's better than a diaper, I guess.
Quickly. And he was prepared. He prepared physically for it and everything. He was all ready to go when, I've forgotten some of the details, but when one of the leaders of the House on the Republican side guessed from the papers in front of him that he was about to reveal the Pentagon Papers. And as I recall, they called for a quorum vote at that time to see if there were enough people there, slowing everything up. And I think he managed actually to stop it some way. Mike had been outmaneuvered. I think he let the guy get the floor somehow in a way that he could have stopped, but he didn't. He then called a meeting of, I think it was Grounds and Fisheries or something like that, a rather obscure subcommittee of which he was the head. He got one other person to sit in the office, member of Congress, for a meeting, and the place was packed with reporters on this, and he began reading the Pentagon Papers into this committee meeting. And I recall very well that after 3 hours of reading, he did something that caused him more criticism, probably even than his defiance in reading these papers, which was that he began to cry. And a senator, that's unseemly behavior. What he was crying about, being extremely tired and pressed after this day of getting prepared and copying all these papers and so forth, was, I remember he told me that he put it, flesh was being seared at this moment. Americans were having metal through their flesh, and Vietnamese, and people were dying. And it was because he had read something in the papers at that point that referred to the drug dealing of the government we were supposedly supporting, propping up there, an illegitimate government, and that we were dying and killing for a government of crooks and drug dealers. And the idea of it just overcame him. In short, he reacted appropriately to the appalling nature of this information. Now, on the one hand, hardly anybody I don't know if anyone in the Congress who actually showed that much concern or sentiment about what was going on actually in the Senate to do such a thing, but certainly didn't have the courage to take this over. He didn't know whether he would be prosecuted. He didn't know at that point whether he might be prosecuted for it, but definitely censured. And a move was made to censure him at that point. And he told me exactly how Mike Mansfield, who was Senate Majority Leader at that point, more or less saved him from being censured. I think he told me also that he had told his wife, look, at worst to worst, I may be expelled from the Senate, he said, for doing this. And that was a real possibility. But he said, if worst comes to worst, I'll go back, I'll do real estate as before, I'll leave my Senate career and so forth. Very hard to think of somebody else who contemplated such a possibility for doing the right thing.
Ben, you're so right on. I just wanted to say one thing because it's happening right now. Yeah. The New York Times put out an obituary on Mike that had more focus on the fact that he wept.
Yeah.
Versus what was in the papers.
Could you imagine? I mean, like, can you believe that? Like, one of the biggest revelations in U.S. history, like, literally reading that into the congressional record and the quote unquote paper of record. I mean, obviously, like, the New York Times is, has very similar interest to the people, the people who run U.S. empire. It's run by the ruling class of this country. But the fact that even as journalists, they decide to focus on the fact that Mike Gravel was crying when he released the Pentagon Papers, less than the release itself, is just absolutely insane, absolutely ridiculous.
And this is mainstream media.
Morning, Ginny.
That's focused not on the content of the papers, but in the way it was presented, which I'm thinking, that's not journalism from anything that I can see. And the obituary writer had been deceased for 2 years. He's so I don't know what they've got. The New York Times maybe, and I'm sad that they don't have enough staff that they can actually have. Maybe Katie, you can chime in on this.
Well, we know that they got rid of their public editor, so those makes sense. And I'll be chiming in more. I want to make sure that, because I know Dan Ellsberg very generously has given us some of his time, despite the fact that he is throwing a birthday party dinner for his own friend, who is, I believe.
Political strength grew. His relations, quote, follows.
What's up here? What's going on? Is this just like the footage that they have left? The failing New York Times.
Trolls.
392?
Yes, that's right. Katie, I was just reminded my wife that they're here. But I would like to add, there's two things in his career that are not very well known. First of all, he did actually go on to get the Pentagon Papers published in Beacon Press edition, which was subject to court proceedings against them that virtually almost came close to bankrupting at that point, and they tried to prosecute aides of his. I think it was Lynn Rodberg who had helped in this process. Again, he was using the speech and debate clause saying that in the Constitution, saying that he could present anything he wanted on the floor of the Senate. Now, 3 senators before that had actually pointed that out to me themselves, how they didn't have to reveal me. They were anxious to use these papers. They couldn't be forced to reveal the source. My attitude was, if it helped somehow the process to reveal that you got them from me or that it was authentic papers or something, otherwise, I'm not anxious to be identified and face prosecution for this, but fine, if you don't have to. Each of those 3, I'll name them, Senator Fulbright, Senator Mathias, Republican, and Senator McGovern, running for president, each of them mentioned, yes, I can do this, and each got cold feet within a day or a week, and something said, I can't afford to do this in my career, even though they would absolutely, there would have been no question of prosecution of them, no legal risk, but their colleagues,
Political
Mike, as in the
careers.
case of Mike, censure them, or in the Fulbright's case, afraid that they would say, oh, he can't keep a secret, we'll take foreign military aid away from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which he headed, and give it to the more friendly Armed Services Committee. And to avoid that, he let me do it, not put it out. So Mike was the exception to that. Later, when I was on trial, he came back to me and said, now the war is still going on. And he said, do you have
this is Daniel Ellsberg. He is he was an analyst in the Rand Corporation during the 1970s, during the Vietnam War, and he released the Pentagon Papers, which were sort of like secret documents that were circulated internally in the Pentagon, sort of describing, various parts of the war, sort of the strategy, how it was going, the atrocities that the United States committed. Daniel Ellsberg leaked it in 1970, and Mike Gravel was a senator at the time. He essentially was a huge supporter, like behind the scenes at the time, and then he eventually read 4,000 pages of these papers, these Pentagon Papers, into the congressional record. And Mike Gravel, who was like one of these sort of iconic, maybe iconic's not the right word, but like a very prominent figure in the anti-war movement since the 1970s, he passed on Sunday. And this is Daniel Ellsberg, the guy that released the Pentagon Papers, sort of talking about that experience. It's really interesting.
Anything more you can put out? And I said, well, actually, what I'd given to Senator Mathias, he had not put out. It was from Nixon himself. That is from his own National Security Council. It was called National Security Study Memorandum 1, NISM 1, NSSM 1. So I gave it to Mike, and he tried to introduce it in speaking again. And this time I said, that's classified? Stop, you can't do that. So they went into, they stopped him from doing, they put on a committee to investigate what the legalities of this were, which included Republican Senator Javits, and I think it was Hart was the other person, Senator Hart, to come back, Democrat. They came back in a closed session and said, surprisingly, there doesn't seem to be any law that prevents us from releasing this classified information. And there wasn't and isn't.
And there shouldn't be.
Congress was not restricted on that. And when I put it to, I'll say specifically, Senator Udall later, who was retiring, that he could definitely put out the 6,000 pages of the torture study that the Senate Intelligence Committee had done it. Absolutely could have done it without any risk of prosecution. No, they were not, that was not what a senator did, in effect. And so we don't have that study.
Have I ever thought about teaching? I'm going back into the classroom on in August. So there you go. back in the classroom in August after a year off. I gotta have to figure out to do it this hour, honestly, because 8 to 9 is not going to be available for me. I might need to make it even earlier in the morning, but we'll see. We'll see what it'll look like. But we have at least we have July. However, I will be on vacation starting the 12th. I will try to bring some recording gear, but I can't promise anything.
So finally, he did put it, he did in fact give it to my suggestion to send it to Representative Ron Dellums, who in fact did insert it in the congressional record, in the House congressional record, 500 pages there, which led to the Dellums rule, as it's called, that you can't put that much into the Congress without somehow permission of the Speaker somehow. In short, what it comes down to is that in 2007, years later, I remember calling Mike when I was quite dismayed at the performance of the Democrats. As often, I'm kind of a self-hating Democrat.
That's kind, the only acceptable kind.
Yeah, and I said, Mike, because they were taking no real advantage during the Iraq War, which Mike opposed, more than any other senator that I can think of more vocally in a run for president at one point. And the one person before Bernie Sanders, I think, since Eisenhower, to use the phrase military-industrial complex in a presidential candidate speech, and to describe that as a major factor in the Iraq War going on. He also said, challenged his other candidates that they would not issue a no first use commitment, that they would not commit never to initiate nuclear war. And looking back at that record, it occurs to me, apparently you can't get the nomination of the Republican or Democratic Party if, like Mike, you take the position you won't initiate the near extinction of the human species by a preemptive attack. Anyway, that's a disqualification, essentially, for getting the nomination. Anyway, they had backed off from impeachment of who was, by that time, the most impeachable president we'd ever had, George W. Bush, for the Iraq War and for a number of other things. And having promised almost, including Ron Dellums, to pursue impeachment, they weren't doing it. And I said to Mike finally, Mike, is it your impression that this Congress is unusually, extraordinarily cowardly? And he said, no, usually cowardly. He said it was just the same 40 years ago. And unfortunately, with him gone and with him out of the Senate.
That's a great point. Like, people love to talk about how, like, oh, Congress, why are those clowns in Congress all such like cowards and losers and all these things, and why are they so divided along these party lines and and like that's coming up as though it's like an exception to the rules, when it's probably one of the most consistent things that has been like a part of the US for, at the very least, 50 years, probably longer, but like, yeah, that is a great point, especially on the subject again of US, imperialism and empire, on war. There's no diversity of opinion. There's no position. There's no dissent even across the board on that. We were talking about that just a minute ago. But yeah, that's just a really important point to frequently bring up.
It pretty much remains that way now. So our memorial to him should be to try to induce or persuade or coerce other people to think about his example and the moral courage that it took, because we humans won't get through this nuclear era and this era of climate change without a lot.
This is Katie Halper. She is the host of the Katie Halper Show. She also does Useless Idiots with Matt Taibbi. She does a lot of things lately, especially that I disagree with. But I these kind of interviews that she does are like really useful and helpful. So I mean, like, again, I try not to write people off. But she was, she's a friend of Jimmy Dore, or she was a big supporter of Jimmy Dore during Force the Vote. But again, she's done great work over the years as well. She's just, got a very wide range of things that she'll get behind her reporting. The fact that she's has this interview proves that she has a lot of value that she brings to the table, despite whatever positions that she might have that I strongly disagree with, and many people that I talk to disagree with. But also, things are complicated.
More moral courage of the kind that is extremely rare and that Mike Gravel showed, your father showed. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much.
That was beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay.
Enjoy the birthday party.
Yes.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so
Well,
much again for your time.
all right. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Dan. Thank
Wow.
you.
Bye.
I know that got me.
I know.
That was really interesting. I mean, yeah, Ellsberg has been doing those kind of interviews for a long time, on that particular subject of his own revelations and U.S. empire, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was really interesting, a really good conversation that they had. So there you go. There you go. Do we want to venture into the wild world of the free part, I suppose you could say, of the Nathan Robinson versus Glenn Greenwald debate, discussion, argument, as Nathan put it? Let's see here.
A lot of
By the
people
way, I
who
hope we're not
get
getting
like
I hope we're
really
not getting nuked today, because we're doing a lot of videos. We're doing exactly the thing that Robert said not to do yesterday. I have to check I might have to do part 1 here today, and if let me check my schedule. I have work in a bit, and if I have a lot of stuff going on, if I have to get out early, then I can probably should push it back to tomorrow. Give me 1 second. 10:30. Okay, we can make this happen. We can make this happen. We can fit this in. All right.
I am really excited to be joined here today with two people who have, frankly, personally played a really formative role in my professional development as a journalist and politico of sorts. Nathan Robinson, founder of Current Affairs Magazine.
Did President Carter pardon had anything to do with what? What pardons? What are you talking about, pardons? I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
The first person, I believe, or one of the first people to ever publish me and put me on the map. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
So nice to be back with you, Bree.
And Glenn Greenwald, one of the founders of The Intercept, another journalistic institution that has been so kind enough as to hire me, and who is now independent, Pulitzer Prize winning, plaudits up the wazoo, who's shown an enormous amount of journalistic courage and integrity. Thank you so much for joining us today from Brazil.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I believe this is my record-breaking, or maybe record-setting third appearance on this podcast. So
I think
we agreed
right.
last time that if I came on again, I was going to have some kind of co-host rights, which I may exercise. But yeah, thanks for having me, Nathan. Thank you for doing it as well.
Okay, so
really weird self intro by Greenwald there. I don't know. Like is he trying to set the tone or something? What scandals are you talking about? I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but it's okay. There's so many U.S. scandals. You might be thinking about the Ford pardons of like Nixon and stuff like that. Maybe that's what you meant.
We're here today because Nathan recently wrote an article critiquing both you, Glenn, and Matt Taibbi, who we recently also had on the show, about what he perceives to be some kind of ideological slippage that you've displayed of late, in which, and I'll let you put it in your own terms, Nathan, but the gist of it is that there seems to be a kind of a lack of skepticism about certain right-wing arguments that has.
I would put this on like 1.5 speed, but the way that Nathan talks, it might like tear up the space-time continuum, if you know what I mean. So I'm just going to keep it on single speed.
Has been arguably embraced by you, Glenn. Nathan, how would you...
and by the way, like if I did get my hands on the 2.5-hour version, I would not play it on the air. I think that even though even though I disagree with the paywalling of the conversation, I disagree with that. I don't want to like leak other people's content. I don't want to like stomp on them, because if that happened to me, I'd be pretty ticked off too.
You frame your core disagreement with Glenn.
So I wouldn't say ideological slippage exactly. You know, I've been an admirer of Glenn's work since I first started doing political writing. It was a big inspiration to me, and I would not say, as some people say, Glenn Greenwald has changed. I don't want to litigate that exactly. It might be just that I've noticed things that I disagree with that I didn't notice before. I'm not saying that Glenn has gone conservative, but that I have. And I tried to make this a substantive critique of a few points that I think that I see him making that I think are both wrong and frankly dangerous, and that sort of misunderstand the workings of power in the world. So, for example, I start with a discussion that he had with Glenn Beck, where he's talking about the authoritarianism of the Democratic Party. Now, I detest a lot of the Democratic Party. I'm a staunch critic of the Democratic Party. I've written books about Bill Clinton, endless stuff about Joe Biden, right? But
Nathan sure does write a lot. Like it's kind of incredible the fact that he writes the articles that he does, and like the like long, lengthy like articles that he does, and also like he does so many of them. And he like writes books. He puts out like 2 books a year. It's kind of wild.
You know, Glenn said to Glenn Beck that he couldn't agree more when Glenn Beck said the Democrats were fascistic for talking about the end of the filibuster, adding extra states, packing the Supreme Court. And Glenn Greenwald said that, ending the Senate is because a Democratic idea of ending the Senate is because they're a genuinely repressive and tyrannical party. Now, I think that's a complete misunderstanding of the situation, right? The Senate is the enemy of democracy. It was set up as the enemy of democracy. The idea of enfranchising Puerto Rico and DC, and even of packing the Supreme Court, is partly because the United States government is counter-majoritarian, counter-democratic, and has been that way since the beginning. I don't think these are signs of creeping authoritarianism by the Democratic Party. Frankly, the Democratic Party isn't going to abolish the Senate because, in fact, far from being authoritarian, they're mostly just ineffectual and useless. But if they did start taking these ideas seriously of getting rid of the filibuster and such, it would be a move towards democracy and not a move away from it. So, and when Glenn Greenwald said to Tucker Carlson in the advance of the 2020 election, the Democratic Party is likely to take over at least one branch of government, which is an alarming proposition because they are authoritarian. I think that actually Republican power is still more terrifying than Democratic power, and also that Republicans are stronger than they necessarily look. They're constantly trying to make themselves look weak, but in fact they have functional veto power over pretty much any legislation, right? It's not possible to pass legislation without getting Republican agreements because of the filibuster. If you look at the state level, Republicans...
What do you mean that you feel like he's starting off on his back foot? What do you mean by that?
trying to restrict abortion rights, deny healthcare to transgender youth, roll back voting rights, control school curricula, ban cities from imposing paid sick leave, all sorts of stuff. And Republicans try and create a narrative that the left are really in control. Now, it's a quote from Matt Taibbi, who says that all the power is on the side opposite Fox News. Glenn has not said that in particular, but he has reinforced what I think is a mistaken understanding of American politics that doesn't see, because he has said that the threat of authoritarianism, for example, didn't come at all from Donald Trump. It comes more from the Democratic Party, which he has described as fascist. I think that, obviously I don't like the way that many Democrats are, show fealty of deference to the FBI, CIA, etc., and that ought to be criticized. But I think we really need to understand it is very important to be clear that, to my mind, I share Noam Chomsky's opinion that Donald Trump was one of the worst criminals in human history because of his acceleration towards.
He doesn't feel confident he normally does, or he's planning to get double teamed. I mean, maybe that's what the case is. I don't know. I don't know. I guess maybe we'll see as this unfolds.
Climate disaster, because of his firing of inspectors general, because of his refusal to accept the election result, because of immigration, labor rights, every issue you want to take. The Republican Party's agenda is absolutely terrifying. And as bad as the Democrats are, I think it is really, really important to be clear on that distinction. And I think my critique of Glenn, my fundamental critique of Glenn, is that I see a lot of stuff attacking, sometimes, actual bad tendencies among liberals, that I don't think recognizes just how bad that is. And in response to my critique, the things that Glenn said about me are like, the online liberal left, this quote, is trying desperately to show they're not like Chris Hayes. Nathan and those like him built their self-image on being radical leftists, different from their MSNBC watching parents, but now they struggle to find any differences. This is all they've got. But we don't give a shit about their dreary dogma or authoritarian culture and their captivity to the Democratic Party, and are free for their repressive attempts to use in-group coercion to enforce adherence to trite liberal pieties. Now, I just think this is totally wrong. My parents would rather set themselves on fire than watch MSNBC. I am incredibly critical of the Democratic Party. And I just think that it's important to have a nuanced understanding. And I don't think that...
I think that he's right in the sense that Glenn is generally extremely sloppy to whom he applies like terminology, like the liberal elite media or whatever the hell. He's him and Taibbi are both pretty sloppy about how they apply the term liberal specifically. I mean, I would say that Nathan is, definitely he considers himself socialist. He, puts forward socialist principles. A lot of people might call him like a rad lib or whatever the hell, but I think that he's got a decent, solid analysis. It might not be, the same as some other people, but I think that when it might not be, I don't know. I think that he just sort of sloppy. I think Glenn sloppily applies those kind of labels to discredit. That's at least my read. He may have just had a whole lot to say and was nervous. He'd be given a time to get it all out. I mean, that's just the kind of manic energy that Nathan always kind of has, though. But I don't know. I haven't sensed any lack of confidence or whatever on his part, other than the fact that look, Nathan obviously respects the work that Glenn has done over the years, which is again absolutely 100% unassailable. The work that he's done on Operation Car Wash, the work that he's done with Snowden and the NSA revelations, you can't attack that. So I guess and that's a very, very important and powerful reporting. So I guess my point here is that Nathan is trying to be both one, respectful, and two, extremely nuanced. So maybe that's what might be coming through to you. I don't know. That might be what's coming. But I think he's making a pretty strong argument about just specifically the positions that Glenn has been taking lately. The part of the problem in the framing of this is the sort of central question, right? The central question is, And I don't know if this was, I can't remember if this was, I don't think this is what Bree said in the setup of this, but like, is Glenn a useful idiot for the right? Like, the subject of the debate is one of the people in the debate. That's really awkward and weird. You know what I mean?
This attack on my motives really does a service to what I think are substantive critiques of the positions that he's voiced.
So that was a lot. Glenn, do you have a reaction to any part of that?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. You know, I think that first of all, if you listen,
I think generally speaking, if anything else, if you know, you might have critiques of Nathan for being like you know, a little bit, you know, dry or like long-winded or whatever. I don't have those critiques, but I like Nathan a lot, and I think that his writing's really good. Could probably use a little bit of editing, but it's and he does have an editor, by the way. But like I think that if he's nothing else, he's very precise in what he puts out there. I think that he's very concerned about that and concerned about his accuracy, and he doesn't want to be he doesn't want to misrepresent, especially people like Glenn. But I think that that and you know, I haven't talked to him about this, but I think that he believes that, you know, there's nothing, you have nothing to, when you're correct on your facts, that actually benefits your argument to a great extent. And I mean, I agree with that. Like, there's no reason to hide from the facts here. Like, he actually does think the facts don't care about your feelings. Like, unlike the way that like somebody like Ben Shapiro would like disingenuously use that kind of a language. Okay.
What Nathan said, there was a lot of kind of genuflecting to the idea that he views the Democratic Party as flawed, as doing bad things. He certainly has expressed criticisms in the past of figures like Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. That's all certainly true. But if you listen to the worldview that he just laid out, it is a very pro-Democratic Party, anti-Republican Party worldview. It's something that would fit very comfortably within the confines of, say, MSNBC or CNN. They have leftists on there who, like Sam Seder or Mehdi Hassan, whose basic worldview is what Nathan laid out, which is, look, I have my differences with the Democratic Party.
You know, I wonder if there's beef between Glenn and Mehdi Hassan, honestly. You remember, like, during the election, there was a big Mehdi Hassan hate fest because he was doing some like, you know, some stuff where he would sort of highlight candidates other than Bernie Sanders, and people on the left would get very upset about that. He was, I think, unfairly critical of the Sanders campaign at various points. I don't recall exactly what the specifics were. However, you know, there was at that time, Mehdi was at The Intercept, and so was Glenn. And I wonder if there's any sort of like remaining tension, if you know what I mean. I can't imagine not. He just name checked him on the show. Maybe I'm just being drama though.
Basic worldview is what Nathan laid out, which is, look, I have my differences with the Democratic Party, but when push
and by the
comes
way, and again, Nathan Mehdi Hassan is doing really well as well right now on and he works connected to NBC on the Choice Channel on the Peacock app. So, so in terms of the framing of things that, you know, Glenn, I mean, not that Glenn is putting things out, that Mehdi Hassan and Sam Seder are both sort of puppets for the DNC and MSNBC, that might actually help his at least framing of this argument.
Like when the rubber
or it's part of his
road,
framing.
You're damn right. I'm going to be giving my support to the Democratic Party because they're much better and much less dangerous than the Republican Party is. I think that's the basic framework in which Nathan resides. I mean, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth. I think that's more or less what he said explicitly. And, you know, I think that, you know, and that's been Noam Chomsky's basic argument that he kind of rolls out once every 4 years as well, which is obviously I'm a critic of the Democratic Party, but at the end of the day, you have to vote for them because the Republican Party is worse.
Well, Glenn, do you
And I think there's
go ahead.
So let me just make a couple points just because of the article by Jonathan Cook, the former Guardian editor, that I think did a reporter that I think did a really good job of kind of
Little New York
isolating
Tommy.
what he thought was driving these differences. So first of all, I do think that one of the things we have to acknowledge is that
First of all, he's taller than Glenn.
Politics has changed greatly because of the Trump years. There's really no denying that. I mean, you can see, for example, that alliances have shifted. Former Bush Cheney operatives, like the worst ones, the people who were most hated by liberals throughout the war on terror, are now MSNBC hosts. Liberals poured money into the Lincoln Project, a group run by the slimiest scumbag GOP operatives like Steve Schmidt and Rick Wilson. Neocons are now explicitly Democrats, David Frum and Bill Kristol, Jen Rubin, Max Boot. Look at, liberal media outlets like MSNBC and CNN, and they're filled with nothing but ex-CIA operatives, FBI agents, federal prosecutors. These are the heroes, the kind of North Stars and icons of the Democratic Party, which was not really true 4 years ago.
All right. Whoa. All right. So he's saying that these neocons, these horrible like demons, are icons of the Democratic Party, and that's where like Glenn is totally off the rails, right? Like maybe like the sort of like Rachel Maddow version of like MSNBC or whatever might be in support of these monsters, or at least like entertain them and put a platform on them or whatever. But like, as far as them being like broadly held up by a broad base of people, that's only like they're only for insiders. Those motherfuckers have zero actual constituency in the world. And like, I think Glenn's being a little bit messy and sloppy here when he does that, when he points them out as being like some kind of leaders there. Now, do they have outsized influence in the Democratic Party? Do they have the ear of people like people in the executive branch? Do they have outsized influence in like the Pentagon and the FBI and CIA and connections in these institutions? Absolutely. Yes, 100% they do. You can't even argue against that. However, sorry, I'm clipping a little bit. However, at the same time, you can't like look at that. Yeah, everybody on the left complains about the Lincoln Project. It's a dynamic. However, it's not disqualifying for everything else. It can't be otherwise. I mean, again, like those critiques, you don't have to. If you had to point that out every single time you talked about the Democratic Party, that's all you would do. And like, I don't know. Like he's not like wrong. He's wrong in one thing. He's not wrong in saying that these people have undue influence in the Democratic Party. That's 100% right. However, saying that like if you're not pointing this out at all times, then you're complicit is where he loses me. If you know what I mean.
Years ago, Bill Kristol and David Frum were still Republicans, and now they're not. They're now Democrats. And so something has obviously changed.
And again, yeah, you say both parties are full of insiders that get too much attention. Yes, and like part of what the neocon thing is, like part of what they do, they're the people that drive what we talked about earlier, which is that consensus, right? That bipartisan consensus, because they don't give a shit about parties. They understand that there is this consensus there, and which side they end up being on at any given time, you know, Republican or Democrat, is purely based on opportunism. Purely based on opportunism. Where can they do the most? Where they can do the most to advance the U.S. empire? Is they'll just like say, okay, the Republicans are toxic. We can make some hay off of being anti-Trump Republicans. Let's make the Lincoln Project. We're Democrats now. Okay, the Bush administration is ascendant. We can We can sort of like get onto there, support the president, support the country, and we can essentially push for wars abroad in the United States, Afghanistan, massively increase the security state, basically have an automated robot army of drones in those areas, start a, whatever. Like those things are both like the party doesn't matter to them. And I think that's again, and Glenn is sort of saying that they aren't Dems, they're just not on board with the Nazis. I mean, they're on board with the Nazis. They just don't like the optics of the Nazis, if you know what I mean. They're on board with that shit. They just don't want to be implicated in it. So they would like to be on the side that's not like that has the less liability, that's still doing the same shit that they already want to do.
Changed in the word work. And then beyond that, you look at polling data where the huge gap exists.
They don't like the Nazis' optics, if you know what I mean.
Between Republicans and Democrats on their views of institutions that Nathan referenced, but kind of dismissively so, but that I think are at the center of American political life. Things like the CIA and the FBI, Democrats and liberals hold those institutions, those security state institutions, in much higher esteem, much higher than Republicans do. There's almost no space in Democratic Party circles for criticism of the CIA and the FBI or the NSA or the Pentagon, as we saw this weekend when, General Miley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, went before the Senate, and the only people who were criticizing him were on the right, and people on the left were kind of saying, this is outrageous. How can you criticize?
All right, that is an Uno reverse card move right there, because it totally decontextualized what the conversation is. Every single person that I've talked to, or even when I talked about that on the left, literally said, this is contextualize it by saying, this is a general talking. This is one of the people with the most blood on their hands in the country, and like with that context present, all of that stuff still applies. He made a specific argument about fucking critical race theory, like in that nuanced, like that specific context, the general made a good point. And like just sort of like laying that out there and just saying, well, you're agreeing with the general, then you're wrong too, her forehead, then that's just like ridiculous. Like by nature of the position, you can't be like, you can't agree with this person, and one, and then two, like, I don't know. It just feels like when you do that, he's sort of like giving outsized credit to people like Tucker Carlson, who are literally making a fascist counterpoint to what the general's saying, like essentially he's weak or whatever for putting forward the argument that he did. So like it's this is a mess, actually.
A war hero. I think it's not just the alliances, but the values that have shifted really a lot. So that analysis that would have applied in 2015 to whether Democrats are better than Republicans, I don't think is really quite applicable. And I think it shifted a lot of up people's perspectives, because as the political framework around you shifts, so too does your perspective. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think one of the big differences that Nathan and I have is the question of what is power. To me, the question is not that interesting. Like, is Donald Trump worse than Joe Biden? Or is Donald Trump, like, does he have worse views than Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi? For me, the question in politics is, who's likely to do the most damage? And I think one of the big divisions in liberal left politics is how you view Donald Trump. Like, did you view him as this kind of unprecedented fascistic or even Hitlerian type figure who was in this unprecedented way going to usher in fascism and posed an existential threat to American democracy? Because if the answer to that is yes, then I think it justifies a whole range of things, and not even justifies, but almost requires a whole range of views in order to combat it. You would want to fortify the FBI and the CIA and online censorship and domestic surveillance, if you really believe that this political movement was about to destroy American democracy and implement actual fascism, of course you would hug Bill Kristol and David Frum and John Brennan and Michael Hayden or whoever was on your side in battling against that. That would be rational to do. I never saw Trump that way. I see Trump as this like very weak figure who never got close to even trying to, let alone being able to, overcome the enormous institutional authority that exists in the United States that's designed to preserve status quo stability. And then the last point I wanted to make is just really quickly, Bree, is like when, like Nathan read several quotes of mine where I'm talking about Democrats being authoritarian and fascistic and the like. And, my leading examples are not things like wanting to do away with the Senate or anything like that. That was more like an example that I gave in that one interview of how Democrats will try and change any rules as long as they believe it's in their interest to do so. I don't think they're trying to get rid of the filibuster because they view it as a Jim Crow instrument. To the contrary, the Democrats also use the filibuster over and over and over and over again to prevent Republican majoritarian legislation when they were in the minority. I think they want to do DC statehood and get rid of the filibuster because it will help them now. But what I'm talking about when I talk about authoritarianism is the fact that it is the case that the Democratic Party's coalition consists of not just the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and the Pentagon, who were radically against Donald Trump and therefore on the side of the Democrats, but also Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And the most disturbing...
Again, Wall Street and Silicon Valley are purely opportunists, and they're going to be on the side that's going to get them the most. So, I mean, like, again, definitely don't hold up, Bill Gates and, whoever else. Like, the Silicon Valley motherfuckers, the Wall Street motherfuckers, the Jamie Dimons, these people that Obama put a lot of faith in 2008 even. Don't hold them up either. But I mean, like, resigning to the fact that that's like a permanent state of affairs. I mean, these people themselves, like, if you look at the records, I mean, they give to Democrats and Republicans. They associate with both parties because that's what gets them the most, specifically when it comes to Wall Street. Because so actually the one that's being the most sort of partisan here is Glenn, if you ask me.
Incident for me, or one of them, because that kind of is illustrative of why I say the Democrats are so authoritarian, is 3 weeks before the election, when the New York Post got its hands on an archive that was from the son of the presidential frontrunner, Joe Biden, that contained a lot of personal stuff that never should have been published, but a lot of stuff that reflected on his ethics and on his business dealings in places like China and Ukraine. The Democratic Party demanded that story be censored, and Silicon Valley monopolists joined with the Democratic Party to literally censor and make it impossible to discuss that story on the internet. You couldn't post links to the New York Post story. You couldn't post links to any other media outlet that was posting it. The same thing happened after January 6th when Parler became the most popular app downloaded in all of the United States, and AOC and Ro Khanna went on Twitter and said, we demand that Apple and Google and Amazon, Silicon Valley monopolists, destroy Parler. And then overnight they did. So that to me is this union of state and corporate power, which is the classic definition of fascism, in order to shield Democratic Party authority from challenge. It doesn't mean I don't think there's authoritarian component to the Republican Party. It just means that I think the Democratic Party...
Okay, that's the most out there he's been. Like, the idea that, I mean, like, obviously, like, Democrats are, like, they are doing some of the things that he's saying in terms of, like, whining about Parler or whatever. But, like, it was ultimately Silicon Valley that shut those things down because they essentially tanked the servers, or they basically revoked access to the servers that were holding those websites up. Now, did they do it because of the influence of the Democratic Party? No. The Democratic Party operates as a product, or it's animated essentially mostly as a product of the way that the capital influences them. Capital flows down, not like there's no like bubbling up from there. Now there are parts of the oligarchy that are part of the Democratic Party, yes, obviously. However, like that is kind of an out there position to sort of like Uno reverse card and call the Democrats fascists, right? That's a bit much, don't you think?
In terms of these new coalitions that has formed
Like
in
he's
the Trump
reaching.
years has become deeply authoritarian as well.
Just to interject, so I think that that's really a clear teeing up of the issues, but a few things, Glenn. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, you have defended or would come out in defense of the NSA or the FBI or any aspect of the national security apparatus, though I think you're right, Glenn, that plenty of liberals do. And I say that just because I do think there's a bit of a conflating here happening between someone who is closer to a Mehdi Hassan MSNBC host, no disrespect Mehdi, but Nathan, who I think there's space between me and Nathan, right? But I also don't think it's helpful
I totally agree with you. Like I think Mehdi would also, if I asked him, say that he thinks the CIA is a pernicious presence in American life. I have no doubt that Nathan would. I don't mean to imply at all that Nathan's a defender of the FBI and the CIA, but I don't think that. I think that that's a lot more important of an issue than Nathan does. Like it plays a lot bigger role in my worldview than it does in his. That's why I spend a lot more time talking about the union between security state power, Silicon Valley monopolistic power, and the Democratic Party.
Right.
And it plays a big. So I don't mean at all to suggest that Nathan is a fan of the FBI. I don't think he's Bill Kristol. I think there's huge differences ideologically.
You heard it here first, folks. Nathan is not a fan of the FBI, according to Glenn Greenwald.
Between Nathan and establishment liberals. But I think that
that he's so one of the things that I actually kind of appreciate that he said just there is that he is Glenn is actually highlighting his own sort of like perspective-based blinders, right? He's or the guardrails by which that he does see politics, and that's actually very illuminating that he is so like seemingly obsessively focused on these points of like specifically empire and US authoritarianism at home and abroad. However, like that's illuminating from the further perspective that he's not looking at the full picture. He's admitting that right now, that he's not looking at the full picture beyond those sort of like rails that he just mentioned. That's at least what I'm hearing when he says that.
Democratic Party,
right.
And it plays a big. So I don't mean at all to suggest that Nathan is a fan of the FBI.
So it's a question of emphasis more than anything.
He's Bill Kristol. I think there's huge differences ideologically between Nathan and establishment liberals. But I think that the worldview that Nathan laid out, despite those differences, nonetheless brings him to the same destination as those other people.
So I think that's a really important point, because it seems to me that throughout a lot of this, it's a matter of where we put the emphasis and what we perceive to be the biggest threat. And Glenn, what seems to motivate you a lot, and which I frankly empathize with in my own work, is that I tend to be attracted to issues that not as many people are talking about, because it feels like that's where I'm most useful. And it feels like those are areas where there's a lot more potential for overreach and abuse because people aren't watching them as closely. And I was frustrated similarly by the vote blue no matter who dynamic, and the fact that it really hinges on getting people to say and embrace the idea that Trump is worse, because that opens up a whole panoply of like a whole chain reaction that says, well, then if you agree that Trump is worse, you have to do this, that, and the other. And what that does is obscure other paths, other strategic avenues that one could go down if you didn't have that kind of absolutist framework. So Nathan, I wonder how you feel about the idea that the difference might be not substantive in many respects, but about this question of emphasis and whether it's necessary for someone to constantly emphasize that Trump does present some kind of threat in order to be credibly heard on other kinds of threats that exist.
Emphasis is actually an important description of I think the core difference between Glenn and myself, because one of the reasons that I see, and again, that Chomsky saw Trump as the greatest criminal in human history, is because if your emphasis is on...
I will say I think that is a bit of a reach by both Chomsky and Nathan from the perspective of the, like, in terms of the ability or the potential to be the greatest criminal in human history. I think that Trump definitely had that, but in terms of like actual, numbers, in terms of actual, blood on their hands, the Bush administration and what it was able to execute was far more effective at being a horrible, like, terrible administration. Like, part of the problem with this, so I'm agreeing with Glenn to a certain extent that that Trump was sort of a buffoonish figure. However, again, the danger. This is so what Chomsky and what by extension Nathan, or not by extension, by alignment, I guess you could say, Nathan are getting at is that there's a possibility that there's a more of a potential for what could have been the greatest criminal in human history or whatever. Like, by the way, Hitler, but whatever. That's a pretty massive fucking claim with a lot of that out there.
Greatest criminal in human history, is because if your emphasis
Also
is
Hitler,
on
like,
climate, if it's on labor rights, which Trump just shredded, if it's on the rights of immigrants, if it's on workplace safety, then Trump is obviously completely monstrous, and it's important to do a lot to stop him. Now, I don't accept, and it's often heard, and this was in Jonathan Cook's article too, this idea that if you think Donald Trump is one of the worst criminals in human history, it justifies doing anything to stop him. Now, the reason that it doesn't is precisely because we can see what the consequences of letting that justify almost anything would be, right? If you say, Trump is such a huge threat, thus we can do anything, including censorship, including mass murder, right? Where do you stop? And then you lose all of your principled commitments. So I think but I mean, again, and I share with Chomsky the belief that you can hold these two beliefs at the same time, which is that you don't have to downplay the very serious threat that Trump poses on all these issues that matter a lot to me. I understand why they are sort of, I don't want to say that Glenn cares about them less, but that, your focus has always been on a lot to do with surveillance, censorship, free speech, and such. But if that is your main focus, then it is understandable that for someone whose main focus is, for example, the fact that the West of the United States is about to be completely on fire, or the fact that buildings are collapsing in a deregulatory culture, right? We would have a very different view of what matters. I mean, I look at state legislatures and I see them currently trying to basically reshape school curricula for political reasons. That really, really deeply alarms me. So in some ways, we do just have a different focus, and that different focus gives us leads to a different assessment of how serious, in fact, the threat is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just on that, a couple of things I think, because it gets to like one of the nubs of the different ways of looking at this. So Bree, I think what you said was very perceptive and also very important. I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to emphasize that. It is true. Like when I started writing about politics, remember I didn't have a media platform, right? I just created a blog. And the reason I did that was because I thought there were things that were being ignored or overlooked that deserved attention. Not because I thought those issues were the most important issues. I was writing about Article 2 theories of executive power and the NSA scandal that broke when the New York Times reported that there was spying going on domestically without warrants. It didn't mean that I thought that was a more important issue than, say, income inequality or criminal justice, overly punitive criminal justice, things I ultimately did write about. I was writing about those things because I felt like that's where I could make an impact. That's where I could make a difference, because that was the stuff that nobody else was talking about. So when I go to sit, it's funny, I saw some video today that I did where I did a Democracy Now! Segment that somebody had posted about Russiagate, and there was like 3 minutes of me saying that all the reasons why I thought Trump was this incredible menace, this grave threat to the functionality of a healthy democracy, why he was incredibly corrupt, things that I've said over and over and over and over again. I mean, obviously I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's ideology, nor of his governance, but I look at the media world around me and I see that pretty much everyone outside of like right-wing news outlets are waking up every day and doing nothing but saying over and over how Trump is this enormous threat. People are writing best-selling books about it. Republicans are saying it and becoming heroes of the liberal media. NBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times op-ed page, the Washington.
No, he's right about that. Honestly, like the Trump bad applause is like super annoying, and like, yeah, that's a fair enough point. But I think like having that be like a key point of emphasis for like the general critique, when I mean, like, you have to contextualize that as the atmosphere and kind of move on from there. I do think it's helpful that he's pointing out that that while that is happening, the vipers from the fucking neocon movement or whatever are sliding in. The problem that I think that's not the point that Nathan's article brings up. The problem that he highlights is that Tucker Carlson, who is like basically one of those vipers, or he's one of those vipers. He is. He might claim to be like a populist or whatever the hell, but like he is getting highlighted and supported, and Glenn goes on his show like in all of this. That's kind of part of the fucking problem, right?
Post op-ed page, the papers themselves are all dominated by that similar theme. So when I think about how I can best use my platform, I don't think about, well, let me go ahead and just echo what everyone else is already saying, because I don't think there's a lot of value in that. There may be value to me. My career would probably thrive more kind of seamlessly and effortlessly. I'd be less disliked or more well-liked if I were to do that. But in terms of the impact, I just don't think that would make a lot of impact. There's all this stuff about Trump being the gravest danger was being said by everybody, from like all those Republicans we just got done talking about to, Nancy Pelosi and Rachel Maddow, to Noam Chomsky and Nathan Robinson. That there was hardly like a need for me to be screaming from the rooftops about Trump's evil. And so instead, what I focused on were the things that I thought were being done to the Democratic Party in response to Trump that were incredibly dangerous, that were being overlooked, like really serious forms of authoritarianism, a revitalization of neocon ideology and the FBI and the CIA as really dangerous institutions interfering in our democracy. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I find it a little bit odd, this like sudden, or in Chomsky's case, not sudden at all, like this almost monomaniacal focus on climate as the reason that Trump, has to stand out as this grave evil. And I just had an email exchange with Chomsky where he defended that position by citing that argument again. Because the reality is that for 4 years, nobody was talking about climate. Nobody was talking about climate. Overwhelmingly, the threat that Trump posed, according to most media outlets, was Russia, was the fact that he was blackmailed by Russia, that he was controlled by Russia. And a big part of my split with the left, or liberalism, became that I just didn't.
He slipped up there. He slipped up there. Like he's talking about his split with the left, and then he corrected himself to liberalism. That sort of like, maybe this is me being unfair again, but that indicates to me that he sort of like sees these two entities, these two ideas, or these two perspectives in a very similar lens. But maybe that's me being uncharitable.
It's a real scandal from an evidentiary point of view. Like, I just didn't think it was true that he was in bed with the Russians, that he had colluded with the Russians, that he was being controlled by the Russians. And I also thought it was an incredibly dangerous thing. So had And one of my arguments all the time about Russiagate was all the stuff that Nathan just said about deregulating the economy. Part of the problem was all of that stuff was being drowned out because everybody was talking about Russia instead.
I agree that Russiagate was all a bunch of bullshit. This is the problem, and I think one of my critiques of the approach you take here is to say, well, everyone's criticizing Trump all the time, therefore we're going to go in a different direction and examine the Democrats. But what you and I both know is that the criticisms that were being made of Donald Trump were frequently the totally wrong criticisms. As you said, nobody was talking about climate. Noam Chomsky was talking. He's been talking about climate the whole time and saying like that is the reason Trump is such a serious threat. This Russia bullshit. So yes, there's all this anti-Trump stuff, but it was totally unpersuasive, right? Trump came very close to winning re-election, and he did that in spite of the fact that, as you would point out, these news networks that nobody watches or cares about, MSNBC, CNN, right, are going like, Trump is a terrible threat. He's a terrible threat. But then the arguments they give are completely unpersuasive. So the approach that I've taken and that I think Chomsky takes and is correct is to say, no, what we need, I mean, I wrote a whole article called Bad Ways to Criticize Trump. And one of the reasons I did a whole book about Trump, Anatomy of a Monstrosity, is that I believe that...
Good book plug. Well done with the book plug. Gotta respect it.
Is to say, no, what we need, I mean, I wrote a whole article called Bad Ways to Criticize Trump. And one of the reasons I did a whole book about Trump, Anatomy of a Monstrosity, is that I believe that all of the anti-Trump stuff was totally ineffectual because it was not getting at the real sources of why the Trump's Republican agenda was such a serious threat.
But why do you think that is, Nathan? Why do you think that is?
I don't think Chomsky's going back on bad faith, if I'm honest. I don't think Chomsky's going back on bad faith.
That if the Democrats care so much about climate and immigration and income inequality, they spend all their time talking about Russia instead of those things.
Because most of them don't care about anything.
I agree. Exactly. Exactly. I agree totally. They don't give a shit about those things, which is why, exactly. So, look, I think those things are dangers. Those things that you just described. We probably have differences on how dangerous they are and whatever, and how to best deal with them and the like. But I also think, and this is, I guess, what has frustrated me a lot about this kind of discourse over the last 4 years is even if you think Trump is dangerous, like Trump is one power center in the United States. He's not, I don't even think he's close to the most powerful, even when he was president. But even if you want to say he was, there's tons of other power centers that were pushing it back against him all the time and were doing very dangerous things as well, often in the name of undermining him. And that's what was getting so little attention. And in a lot of ways, American liberalism didn't just start ignoring that, but applauding it. Things like online censorship and, greater power in the hands of the FBI to track people they regard as domestic extremists and joining with Wall Street and Silicon Valley. You say Trump almost won despite networks that nobody watches. It wasn't just despite that. It was Wall Street and Silicon Valley overwhelmingly funded the Democratic Party. Almost all institutional power was behind.
Yeah. I mean, like, the specter of Chomsky is fucking looming over this debate. And, like, you're right about that. And, like, I don't know, man. Like, the way that, like, it almost feels when Glenn's the one that keeps invoking Chomsky. When he does that, he's like creating a proxy argument where he's arguing with Chomsky and not with Robinson. That's sort of like my read on that, which is like a little bit like it puts you in an awkward position if you're the person that's directly talking to Glenn, because then you're like expected to defend like the Chomsky position when that might not be your position. Now, in many cases, because I know that that Nathan has a lot of like respect for Chomsky and aligned with Chomsky in a lot of ways, that might not be so like there might not be as much of a disconnect as things are, but like there's just a genuine like a regular awkwardness, like a natural awkwardness to defend positions that are ascribed to someone else and not you. At least not directly.
behind defeating Trump because they perceive
which is kind of a destiny move, right? It's kind of like one of those like technical, like, I'm going to put you on your back foot because of this, like putting you in an awkward debating position. I don't know. I'm not saying that Glenn's being bad faith, but I'm not saying that, but it is kind of like a tactic.
him as this kind of unpredictable, unstable force. And so, I think that there were a lot of dangerous things being undertaken by this very powerful coalition aligned against Trump that was receiving way too little attention. And even with Trump gone, still is receiving too little attention.
But Nathan, I don't think he would disagree with any of that. Would you, Nathan?
No, although I would say that I think some of it is a little illusory. Like, I think a lot of opposition to Trump was discursive rather than substantive, and that ultimately, like, Trump was very, very good for the business community, right? Very few of them actually. They might detest him as like putting a very vulgar face on American capitalism, but he gave them their tax breaks.
Right. So
they may say they dislike him, but not much. There's actually not much done to undermine him. But other than that, a lot of those critiques, I certainly agree with. Right, I got censored by The Guardian when I tried to write about Hunter Biden. So I know this firsthand.
That's why it seems to me that the issue isn't, and I don't. The issue does seem to be about this proportionality point, because I know, since I've had you as an editor, Nathan, I think that's something that you do that isn't identity politics, why it's important for people to be able to make political arguments on the basis of their historically marginalized groups, all of that kind of stuff before I dig into my critique of the weaponization of identity politics. And I think that gives a lot of people who might otherwise listen to me, or who thinks that, a critique of identity politics is just a right winger who doesn't like to acknowledge the existence of race or racism, it lays the foundation for them to trust me. And what it feels like sometimes is that trust, when it comes to Glenn, has been lost. And I think that some of that is unfair, because people accuse anyone who is critical of the Democratic Party as being a Trumper and yada, yada, yada. But I think that there is part of it, Glenn, that is potentially valid, because whether or not you feel like you should have to build in some of those caveats, it would help you if you did. And moreover, there are these moments, Nathan, you wrote about this one exchange that Glenn Greenwald had with Glenn Beck, where Glenn Beck trots out a bunch of, I think, unfair criticisms of Democrats. One of which was the Senate, which I would agree with you on substance, Nathan, is an anti-democratic body. And then Glenn Greenwald, in your response, you didn't really acknowledge the substance of what Beck had said. You just said, I agree. And then you levied your own criticisms of the Democratic Party, right? So it wasn't that
this
you
is getting pretty
agree.
inside
I don't think you
baseball.
actually substantively agreed with Beck in the exchange. You didn't pick up on any of the things that he has specifically talked about. But in effect, listening to it, you end up tacitly condoning all of his criticisms in total. And I think that is something that is of concern if you go on news sites like Fox News, which I completely support and have no issue with. But if you don't at the same time push back against those aspects of the arguments that are made there that you don't actually agree with, because then you just look like you end up co-signing.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting. You were talking. I think there's different stuff. We all have different styles, right? That make us be able to have an impact, be able to be heard in this like enormous, almost infinite media ecosystem, right? There's a reason why Current Affairs has its fans. There's a reason why Bree has a big online following. There's a reason why I've been able to have a large readership and be heard for a long time. And there's no one right way stylistically of doing that. Some people are just more kind of conciliatory in their debating or speaking style, and that's effective for them. And other people are just more kind of combative and aggressive, and that works as well. And a lot of that is just, what our personality traits are. I do think like a lot of this though is about what our role is and how we conceive of it. I never really saw myself as being, certainly not kind of a spokesperson for the Democratic Party, but even beyond that, like I never saw myself as being in captivity to a particular ideological dogma. Like the only label I've ever really been comfortable with accepting for myself is civil libertarian, because it's kind of a narrow set of views and principles and values that I'm very comfortable accepting. So one of the things that, I do think a lot about is I'm only interested in doing this work, and it is work, right? Like we're here on a Saturday, we're in front of our computers, we're talking about politics, it's going to get promoted online, it's going to generate work, we're going to have to talk about it. I'm only interested in that if it can actually have like an impact on the world, if it can actually make the world a different place than it would be without that. And so the way that, politics can be done, which is like, okay, I'm in this camp, I identify more with liberals or the left than I do with the right, and therefore I'm going to kind of defend the left, defend liberalism. That is a way of doing politics, but I ultimately find that way to be kind of ineffective. Like I feel like it doesn't change a lot. It's what I probably did more than not for the first 5 or 6 or 7 years of my work, but that kind of, I'm going to be on the left, I'm going to criticize Democrats, at the end of the day I'm going to vote Democrat. I just feel like that's not getting anywhere.
But I'm with you on
like
that, Glenn.
Kind of,
I'm 100%
right,
in your camp on that part. But it's the part where you can end up. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So like what I've been doing a lot more of is looking for ways that people who think that they're irreconcilably apart and even adversarial can actually recognize similarities that they are taught not to see. And so going into right-wing venues and speaking to them like in a respectful way about their worldview and making them open to the things that I say is a really valuable opportunity for me, because I can put in front of them things that they would not otherwise be open to. And so it's, there are times when I go on Fox and someone says something and I will object to the premise of the question. But usually what I'm doing in those cases is looking for ways to say, these are things that even though you see yourself on the right as agreeing with, and even though this person on the left sees themselves on the left, we actually have these similarities in common that we can come together and work towards, because that's the only kind of politics at this point that I think can really make a difference and that interests me. And so maybe you're right that I'm not as like confrontational when I'm in right-wing venues by saying, oh, you said this and this is totally false. But I think it's because my mindset is looking for bridges to build and not burn.
But why is he building bridges with like this is the main critique. This is, I think, actually walking into where the critique that many people have of Glenn is. And like I think the critique is that he's trying to build bridges, or is constantly consciously trying to build bridges with right-wing figures, and at the expense of alienating, people on the left, or people who sort of like see themselves as like sort of like generally left, but like might align with the Democrats and things like that. And when that happens, when he starts like making these sort of like the Democratic Party and everyone who associates it with it, including Nathan and including Chomsky or whatever the fuck, are like compromised in some way. Like normal people that see that are going to either agree with him or be alienated by that. So I think what he's doing, in effect, even if his intention is to build sort of like a populist bridge, to the sort of like populist quote unquote right, is that you're disorganizing the left, and you're sort of like assigning some level of credibility to the right that's cohering them. And then also at the same time, there is sort of a pipeline effect that you're doing. You're sort of you're discrediting like some of these sort of like liberal or left-wing figures and essentially holding up people like Sagar and Jetty and fucking Glenn Beck and Tucker Carlson, who are like not they don't have anything good for you. Like they're literally taking the position of being like anti-imperialism purely out of opportunity. Like they're not against that shit at all. So like maybe Glenn's just naive. Maybe that's what this is. If that, I mean, that sounds what he's saying that he's doing.
And yeah, and I don't think if like someone says something and you don't respond, like Nathan has said a bunch of stuff that I haven't responded to just because I've deprioritized it. Same with him. It means I'm condoning it. I just think you have to have like an objective when you're communicating, and that objective will drive the choices you make about what you do address and what you don't.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think this it's another one of those. Is we're back to emphasis, because Nathan, for you in the current affairs, I remember I wrote a piece way back when about how to talk to Trump voters. Should we talk to Trump voters? And I raised as an example the man whose name I always forget. I'm so sorry, but a Black guy who talks to all these Klan members and ends up talking them out of being in the Klan and has like 17 robes in his closet or whatever each. For
there's a difference though between talking to Klan members or like talking to people on an individual level and going on Tucker Carlson's show and agreeing. Maybe she's going to bring that point up. Maybe Nathan's going to bring that point up. But that's sort of like a significant difference from like those two things.
Every man that he's convinced not to be a Klan member anymore. And his approach is not to go in swinging and disagree with what everybody says immediately and be like, racism is wrong, you're a bigot. He sits down, he has a Coke with them, he talks about their kids, and I'm sure things are said that he would object to, and he would have every reason and right to object to, and maybe even an obligation, some would say, to object to. But he lets them slide because he's trying to establish a relationship. Do you think that is
you can't do that with
a fair approach figures for Glenn to be taking? And if so, is it maybe would your answer differ whether or not he's having that as a private conversation versus on Fox News with Tucker Carlson in front of a lot of people who might perceive that kind of interaction differently than a private interaction?
That's a good framing by Bree, by the way.
So that guy who goes and meets with Klan members and develops relationships with them, it's kind of an incredible project. But one of the notable things about what he does is that he goes in there with a sense of mission. His mission is to
Good morning, Mila.
Exorcise their racism. Now, I believe strongly that leftists ought to go on Fox News. I've written a whole article about the way that leftists have successfully sort of jiu-jitsu'd Fox News. Katie Halper did a wonderful appearance. Elizabeth Brunig, Adam Gaffney has done excellent work going on Fox and defending left positions. So I wouldn't ever criticize Glenn for the act of going on Fox. I would say, however, that I think he may be a little naive about Fox News, because one of the things he has said is that he believes that his getting invited on Fox a lot shows that there's kind of a political realignment. But when I look through all the Fox News headlines, it's Glenn Greenwald rips liberals with no scientific training. Glenn Greenwald rips MSNBC's Joy Reid.
Yeah.
Glenn Greenwald rips former Intercept colleagues. Glenn Greenwald rips Brian Stelter. And, Fox News, of course they want you on for that.
But Nathan, though, just to be clear, those are foxnews.com articles that are like write-ups of my tweets, they're not my appearances on Fox.
But when you go...
well, then let's look. I mean, like, the thing that you would want to do at this point in the debate would be to talk about a specific incident of Nathan doing something like that. Of Glenn going on to Fox News and agreeing with Tucker Carlson. If that's the case, that if that's the defense that Glenn's rolling out, then obviously this is in the middle of an argument. Nathan probably doesn't have that kind of stuff queued up, but like that's worth like, if he had an example sitting in the breach, which he might have, Like that's the way that you sort of discredit that sort of like hand wavy defense that he's rolling out, that Glenn's rolling out.
You go on Fox. Have you challenged Tucker Carlson over his white nationalism?
No, it's not. No,
Right.
I mean, I did
so
one.
they will have you on until such time.
And notice that
I
Glenn's
did
getting a
do
little
something
hostile now.
them.
Well, first of all, I have gone on Fox before. I run a Laura Ingraham show and, talked about how Fox News disseminates its own levels of disinformation, similar to what MSNBC and CNN does.
So you see that? Hold on a second. Now, look, MSNBC and CNN do disseminate tremendous amounts of disinformation. Yes. But with Glenn, the way that he just framed that he goes on Fox News and says, yes, of course, Fox News does disinformation, and also so does MSNBC and CNN. Like, what Glenn resists doing is he resists sort of the specifics of what the issue with Fox News is. He resists the specifics of the sort of like he brings MSNBC and CNN and Fox. He's doing the sloppy thing again, right? He lumps them all together, which is not I don't think, like, even if you're in a Fox News audience, you're not like gonna say like, oh, well, I'm gonna change my behavior, I'm gonna change my source of disinformation or whatever the fuck. Like, you're just gonna say like, yes, of course, fake news at MSNBC and Fox, and not believe him. Sorry, MSNBC and CNN, and not believe him about Fox, because Fox is different.
Show and talked about how Fox News disseminates its own levels of disinformation, similar to what MSNBC and CNN does. Is at the beginning of her show, and she said, if you ever see me doing that, let me know, and I will immediately correct it. A month later, she said some false statements about Omar Mateen's wife, who is currently on trial unjustly for collaborating in the Pulse shooting. I called her out and said, what you said is false. She went on air that night and retracted it. When I had Tucker on Jeremy's podcast, we spent at least half the podcast with me confronting Tucker on all the ways that I think he's being racially inflammatory. But again, it's like, I'll give you an example. Like, most of the time when I go on Fox, what am I doing? I'm criticizing the CIA. I'm criticizing the FBI. I'm criticizing the security state or the NSA. I'm also criticizing CNN and MSNBC and the media coverage of liberal outlets and their reliance on security state, propaganda in order to do it. And I do think that's important to put in front of right-wing audiences, to get right-wing audiences conditioned to hearing that the CIA and the FBI are deceitful institutions who are there to interfere in American political life, to subvert the democratic will.
He's talking about Jeremy Scahill on the podcast Intercepted. So I guess I hadn't seen this, but Scahill apparently facilitated a debate between Glenn and Tucker Carlson. I don't know. I mean, the only thing that you can do is trust Glenn's representation of the events, because like, I don't have anything else to go with. Glenn actually he has a lot of dogs, because I think he brings in a lot of like strays. Like, he has like a ton of fucking dogs. He's like a known dog lover, which is like one of the most likable things about him.
Or like on my Substack page, every single time I talk about the dangers of this new war on terror, every time I link it to the abuses and excesses of the first war on terror and what was done to American Muslims. I've been able to interview, Mohamedou Slahi, who was the Guantanamo
at least 7 dogs.
detainee who was in
Good Lord, that's a lot of dogs. I have 5 cats, so
prison for 15 years in
and 2
Guantanamo
dogs.
without due process. I was able to interview Yasser Lawadi, a Muslim French civil liberties activist, about the Islamophobia from Emmanuel Macron, and put it in front of my very heterodox audience, including a lot of right-wing readers who now are receptive to hearing about that, because it's presented in a way that ties it to their worldview in a respectful way. And it is much harder work than if I were to just be talking to a liberal audience applauding everything I was saying. But I just think it's more valuable work. And if you want to say like, look, you sometimes err on the side of being too kind of conciliatory. There are certain things that you should challenge that you don't challenge. I'm sure I make those kind of mistakes.
Right,
It's actually a difficult balancing act to do, to like not pretend that you're one thing, to continue to uphold your values, but at the same time do it in
he's
like
got
the
like a
Lion's
big.
Den in a
I'm
way
sorry.
that
I thought
you're
it was
not
a
like
typo.
the clown who's there. To
He's got like a ranch I mean, he's a rich guy. He's got like a pretty big compound in Brazil. He's got security, things like that. Yeah, they didn't get into that, at least not yet. The horrible like social conservative positions, which I think is actually the worst. Like I can understand the disagreements that they have, like in terms of emphasis with and maybe they get into this in the paywalled part, which I'm not going to watch, but like yeah, there is some weird social conservative stuff that that Glenn like backs up. He's like, I don't know, there's a lot there. It's offensive, yeah.
fight with the host, but you're trying to build bridges to that sector of American political life so that they're in general open to what you're saying because they respect and trust the fact that you're telling the truth. It is a hard project, and I don't claim to be perfect with it, but that is.
I think 90% of that. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, and I actually don't want this to be kind of the source of our disagreement here, because I think that Bernie went on Fox, and I think that a lot of the stuff about there's that like awful like you're the new darling of right-wing media, and it's like, well, I think you have to critique the substantive positions that people are advancing rather than the venues in which they advance them. Current affairs, we try and make left arguments to, I like to think, a non-left audience a lot of the time. I think converting people is a really, really important part of what you do. You can't ignore those you disagree with. That. So I think we share most of what you said, and I think my critique probably would be along those lines of, there are areas, especially when I was watching Glenn Beck, it was that in fact you agreed with him when he said they're trying to get rid of the filibuster, they're trying to expand the Supreme Court, they're trying to enfranchise Puerto Rico and DC because they're a fascist party, and your response was, I couldn't agree more. And I think that is the point at which you have to say.
But Nathan, let me ask you that. Like the Democrat, do you think that the reason the Democrats are in favor of DC statehood and eliminating the filibuster of the Electoral College is because they believe on principle that those are anti-democratic policies, or because it just so happens to be that DC voters are overwhelmingly Democrat, and right now the filibuster is impeding their legislation and getting rid of those things?
I didn't know that. I don't know anything about his legal career at all. I don't know anything about Glenn's legal career at all. But he's not really talked about it very much. I don't know anything about it. You see what he's trying to do, but you feel he's going about it the wrong way. Yeah, I mean, like the sort of like agreement on the social conservative stuff. I would even hesitate to call him a TERF because like he doesn't ever claim to be a feminist in any meaningful way. But like there is some things that he does and says very often that is extremely transphobic, specifically, and that's a big problem. That is a big problem, and I think that he's had some really weird takes on bisexual people as well. So yeah, there's a lot of problems here, but in terms of the sort of like limits of what they've discussed here, he's still wrong. And good morning. It's funny because it's toast. He's still wrong from the perspective of Glenn lost. I didn't see anything beyond the like I said, I'm not gonna like leak the paid version or whatever, despite the fact that like I think that if they're gonna have a 2.5-hour conversation, it's supposed to be an important conversation. It shouldn't be paywalled. I'm not gonna like leak the paywalled part. However, I do think that Glenn's kind of getting rocked here.
Entertaining those things would further entrench their power.
But the important point to make there is to say that those policies are democratically necessary. those are not inherently bad policies. Now, you could say like this for opportunistic reasons by some people. I think some people are genuinely committed to democracy. I'm not completely cynical. I think that a lot of the effort to expand voting rights is because people believe in voting rights. And I think that
and it's that, and the Democrats know that if the voting rights are not expanded, they're going to constantly lose. Like there's a degree to that, and I think that maybe he's acknowledging that.
Confronted with a right-winger like Glenn Beck, the important thing is to say, like, no, we have to get rid of the filibuster. We have to give DC statehood. That's something that we should do because it is the right thing. And we could critique the Democratic Party separate from that, instead of saying, well, I couldn't agree more with what I think is actually kind of a delusional analysis.
What do you think about that?
Well,
Glenn?
I mean, I think, yeah, no, I think like what I think is that the Democrats are interested in changing whatever rules they can change with one metric only driving what they want to change, which is how to further entrench Democratic Party politics. I have zero doubt, that if the District of Columbia were filled with Republican voters overwhelmingly, Mitch McConnell would be waving the flag of democracy to demand DC statehood, and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi would be alluding to the design of the founders about how important it was to keep the Capitol neutral and not part of any.
I mean, you can always watch the VOD. It's funny because it's toast. You can always watch the VOD. They go up every day. But yeah, thank you for watching.
State, they would be on completely opposite sides. So my agreement with Glenn Beck was about the fact that the Democrats are willing to use authoritarian measures, including censorship, including getting into bed with Silicon Valley, including using the FBI and the CIA for political purposes, including changing the longstanding rules of government institutions.
But changing the rules isn't authoritarian. That's not authoritarian. No, that's good.
It is. It depends. First of all, it depends what the motive is. And then I will say, this is, I do think this is a big difference that I have with parts of the left as well, which is like, I don't think that pure majoritarianism is a positive political value. I think it's incredibly tyrannical.
This is just a small fraction.
Okay. So that is weird too. Because like he's saying that majoritarian, like he's basically making an argument against democracy and saying that democracy is tyrannical, which is it's weird that he does that and says that like majoritarianism or whatever is tyrannical and also aligns with right-wing like people that are he himself describes as right-wing populists. Like which one is it? Are you a populist or are you anti-populism? That's a very, very like incoherent sort of position. Yeah, I think that honestly, 2.5 hours, this sounds like a fucking lot. It can't, no, it can be tyrannical. I mean, consensus is also like, unfortunately, in my experience with consensus, can be paralyzing to the perspective of like getting a group to agree on anything that's controversial in any meaningful way. Like you kind of need democracy in certain situations, especially when there are resources at stake. However, I get what you're saying, Ancom, Psycom, from the perspective of like democracy can be manipulated. My point here is that like Glenn's trying to do both sides of that when it comes to, and he's doing that. And again, this is not about a social security conservative positions or anything like that. This is about the limits of what they were talking about here, which is largely surrounding national security and the CIA and stuff like that. Like, there is no majority consensus that the CIA like should do dragnet snooping or whatever, right? Or the NSA should do dragnet snooping, or that the CIA should be able to do drone strikes or whatever. That's sort of like skirted as a democracy question, but he's acknowledging that, I don't know, there's a lot going on there. Like Glenn is kind of all over the place. I'm coming away from this feeling very similarly as I did coming in. No, and again, very few people would Sun Green. Glenn won't risk losing his mansion. Bottom line, like very few people would do that. Good morning, choking on ashes. Very few people would do that. I guess my biggest takeaway is that like Glenn, actually Nathan looks really good in this from the perspective of the critiques that he laid out were sort of vindicated in the article. I think that no, this is just he'd had an argument with Nathan J. Robinson on the Bad Faith show. I don't want to get into the specifics around, where was Virgil for all of this or whatever. But I think he kind of got Nathan Robinson essentially wrote an article critiquing the sort of approach that Glenn has been doing for the past 2 or 3 years, perhaps 4 years, no, probably 2 years. And yeah, he had an argument with Nathan about it, and I think Nathan did really good. The Breeze commenters I don't care, man. Like, I really don't give a shit if the bad faith commenters don't agree with me. I don't think Glenn came off particularly well here. I think that he looked like he was all over the place. I think that, and maybe this is my own internal biases, showing forward, and maybe I'm sort of pushed off of that. I do think though, yeah, Nathan's a really nice guy, by the way. I know Nathan a little bit. Because he's based in New Orleans. I've been in the current affairs office. We've done a current affairs podcast in the office over there with him and Lida. But anyway, the sort of big takeaway is that Glenn couldn't put up a defense for going on to Fox News and agreeing with people. He just sort of said that he disagreed with people, but didn't. I mean, there's no basis for that. If you could pull up 100 clips of him going on Tucker Carlson and explaining why, basically advocating for one social conservative position or another. And they didn't even get into, and this is probably a little bit inflammatory. Or would have been inflammatory for the backgrounds of this discussion, but he did go on fucking a Daily Caller podcast a while ago and call Tucker Carlson and Glenn Beck and Donald Trump equivalent to socialists, which is just completely insane, and again, Glenn's all over the place. I don't know if this is going to be viewed as a takedown or whatever, but okay, let's look at the comments. Now I'm kind of and I got to get after this because I do have work. Where are the comments here? Until the people address the class war that has been waged upon them from the beginning of the industrial age, nothing will be fixed. Both parties represent 1%, regardless of voting Dem or Republican. The results will be nearly almost the same. Okay. I mean, I don't disagree with his first comment. Find it odd that the premise that Glenn hasn't changed, and he went on to explain how he changed. Yeah, he hasn't changed. He literally hasn't changed since. I mean, he's just he's right in that. Glenn's right in that the the vipers of the neoconservative movement have sort of flocked to the Democratic Party, but they were going to do that anyway, and they've always been sort of these bipartisan creatures. They've always avoided being a Republican or a Democrat because that is what benefits an interest empire, because that's what Democrats and Republicans already agree on. So if you're going to criticize one party or the other based off of where the fucking neocons are and the imperialists are, I mean, it really doesn't do you any good. You're falling for a trap there, buddy. I don't know. I think that the precision in all of this that Glenn lays out is not present. His methods have changed, else this would not be something to talk about. I don't know if his methods have even changed. I just think that he's like his analysis of where critique belongs or where where his critique is going is kind of where he loses me. Like there was a very telling point in this discussion, and this is going to be my last point because I do have to go. Where he said that, oh yeah, I go on Fox News and talk about how Fox News is wrong, just like MSNBC and CNN, and I'm just sort of like in how they purvey disinformation. And I brought this up like in the moment. You can go back and check it. It's really I guess telling that he doesn't make a distinction between the sort of positions that Fox News puts forward and the other media, despite the fact that, yes, he is correct in the technical sense that there's disinformation across the media spectrum in mainstream media. Yes. However, the brazenness and the degree of Fox, along with the fact that it is the number one sort of primary right-wing news outlet in America, like he totally downplays that. But I don't know. Nathan looked pretty good on that, and I think that he and Bree kind of aligned in that, even though she did sort of put forward a facilitator role. But either way, this is more like spectacle or whatever of debate. But I thought it was interesting. Yeah, there's blatant racism on Fox all the time. I mean, constantly. But anyway, I do got to get to work. But yes, I love each and every one of you. Also, you can become a patron of this program by going to patreon.com/goodmorningcomrade. You can help us out, keep the show rolling. Patreon.com/goodmorningcomrade. You can be like Ty Jitty, Michael H, Dan O, Jonathan H, Timothy C, Dragonslayer 19, Andy L, Gary W, Rachel K, Kenneth F, and Adam R, Trey M, Watermelon Pickle, and Penelope D. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Y'all have a lovely day. I will check you tomorrow. Love you. Bye-bye.